Hello everyone. It's been so great to meet you all during the different deep dive presentations in class so far. To formally introduce myself, I'm Joseph Abraham, and today I'll be diving into the socio-psychological theory known as social judgment theory. In my opinion, this theory is quite versatile, so you'll see why it fits into the theme of persuasion that we're exploring this week, but also how it's useful in many other contexts as well. Let's get started. Today I'm going to talk about what is social judgment theory, some of the history and how it developed over time. I'll explain how the theory works, as well as give examples of the different applications of the theory that I found in my research. And then finally, I will leave the class with 2 discussion prompts, as well as my references. Looking at social judgment theory through the lens of persuasion, in Dayton and Zelli and some of the sources that they provided this week, social judgment theory focuses on people's assessment of persuasive messages and how the strength of one's attitude affects their evaluation of an issue. It can also provide clues on how to approach a persuasive effort. The theory also has 3 assumptions, as outlined by Dayton and Zelli, which are that pre-existing attitudes influence how we evaluate and judge objects, messages, people, etc. Individuals make decisions based on their anchors or view on a particular issue or topic, and that we can capture others' attitudes by mapping how they evaluate and categorize people and things. Before looking at how the theory works, I wanted to provide a little bit of history and how it developed. The framework for what would eventually become social judgment theory dates back to the early half of the 1900s with psychologist Egon Brunswick, whose research on probabilistic functionalism argued that the psychology of an organism relies as much on its external environment as it does on its internal environment. This environment comes with a lot of uncertainty, and an organism must adapt and use limited information or cues in achieving its goals. In the decades that followed, researchers began extending Brunswick's analysis to areas of human judgment and decision making, looking at how people use cues to make comparisons and form judgments. You'll see elements of this in the applications of the theory that I present later on. As we get into the 1950s and 60s, researchers started applying these insights to social contexts, from international conflict to interpersonal learning. All this research inspired psychologist Muzafer Sherif, the lead founder of social judgment theory, as well as his collaborators. A little background on Muzafer Sherif: according to his obituary in the American Psychologist in 1989, he was considered an influential figure in social psychology, best known for his groundbreaking studies on social norms, group behavior, and attitude formation. Earlier works at Columbia University explored how people look to others for guidance when uncertain, laying the foundation for understanding conformity. Also, later on, he demonstrated how competition fuels conflict between groups and how cooperation towards shared goals can restore harmony. Along this academic journey, Sherif accepted a position as a research fellow at Yale in 1947, where he would meet Carl Hovland, who would become a longtime collaborator of his. In fact, social judgment theory first appeared in their 1961 book, Social Judgment: Assimilation and Contrast Effects in Communication and Attitude Change. This theory would continue to take shape in the years that followed, with additional collaborators, including Carolyn Sherif, who was Muzafer's wife and also a very accomplished psychologist in her own right, and Roger Niebergall. The group had been studying the ways humans interact and influence one another, and were attempting to understand why and how people interpreted information differently. The result was that they determined that people's interpretation and stance on a given issue are determined by 3 factors: their anchor, their alternatives or latitudes, and their ego involvement. Diving deeper into these themes, based on some of the terminology that was defined by Dayton and Zelli relating to this theory, is anchor, a stance or position on a particular topic or issue, which the theory, social judgment theory, argues can be mapped into 3 categories: the latitude of acceptance, which is ideas that a person finds acceptable; latitude of rejection, which are ideas a person finds unacceptable; and a latitude of non-commitment, which are ideas a person has no opinion of, neither accepting or rejecting them. Ego involvement, on the other hand, is how personally significant an issue is to a person. And when you use all of these terms together, to analyze your audience, you can predict how they might respond to different messages. For example, if someone is highly ego involved in an issue and you're trying to persuade them otherwise or away from their position, you're going to have a bit of an upward battle because of how much they have invested personally in that position. Dayton and Zelli also outline the effects of messages sent in different latitudes as it pertains to social judgment theory. One is contrast effect, which is when a message falls within the receiver's area of rejection, they perceive it as further away from their anchor than it really is, subconsciously exaggerating the difference. On the other hand, a simulation effect is when a message falls within the receiver's latitude of acceptance. Therefore, the receiver subconsciously minimizes the difference between that message and their anchor. To help us kind of better understand these terms and put it into action, I wanted to use one of our favorite post-pandemic workplace debates, remote versus in-person work. So let's say that my anchor is that employees should work in the office 3 days a week and home 2 days a week. Like that's the best possible formula, in my opinion. If one colleague says, I think people should only come in 2 days a week, that's pretty close to my view and will likely fall within my latitude of acceptance. I'd probably see it as almost the same as my own opinion. And that's when a simulation effect might kick in, where I view their idea as closer to mine than it actually is, because we're not saying the same thing here. It just feels very similar. On the other hand, if we have a colleague that says, I think everyone should work fully remote every day of the week, then that's probably going to be way outside of my comfort zone based on my anchor, and will likely fall within my latitude of rejection. I'd likely see that view as more extreme than it really is, and maybe even dismiss it. That's why contrast effect may occur, which is when a message feels too far from one's beliefs, and then we push it away and cling even more tightly to our original view. And ultimately, how ego-involved the person is will determine how likely it is that they can be persuaded. So, in full disclosure, I'm not that ego-involved in this topic when it comes to workplace. Remote versus in person, so it's possible that I could be persuaded otherwise. I'm now going to go over 3 different applications of the theory that I found in my research. The first is social judgment theory and health-related matters. When completing the APA research activity assignment earlier this semester, I stumbled upon research titled Using Social Judgment Theory to Study Occupational Therapists' Use of Information when Making Driver Licensing Recommendations for Older and Functionally Impaired Adults. This 2007 Australian study, published in the American Journal of Occupational Therapy, surveyed different occupational therapists in their region of Victoria, Australia, on factors influencing their decisions of whether older adults or functionally impaired individuals could continue to drive. By applying social judgment theory, the study was able to model how clinicians combined probabilistic cues to make complex decisions where no single correct answer exists. This highlighted both the strengths of social judgment theory in capturing individual decision policies and the need for more consistent guidelines in occupational therapy practice. So, what I found interesting about this particular application is you heard the term probabilistic cues, right? And factors was a big role in this. It basically looked at what are these reasons ranked why people were allowing or not allowing older adults or functionally impaired individuals to drive or not. And this was less so about persuasion, which is how social judgment theory is described in our textbook mostly this week, and more so about that origin of this theory that we talked about going back to the framework by Egon Brunswick and sort of this more probability-based clinical judgment role. So that's what I found really interesting about this particular research. And as I mentioned, I think this theory is incredibly versatile in how it is used in society because another research example I found on a far different spectrum was a 2023 article published in AI and Society called Understanding Dynamics of Polarization via Multi-Agent Social Simulation. And this studied how polarization emerges and evolves in online social networks, looking at issues like selective exposure and user tolerance using social judgment theory. More specifically, social judgment theory was used here to model how users shifted their opinions when exposed to different posts. If a message fell within their latitude of acceptance, they assimilated towards it, but if it fell within their latitude of rejection, they contrasted and strengthened their existing view. The authors found that tolerance to these social posts slowed polarization. Selective exposure, so in this case, think algorithms that you see on different social networks, intensified polarization, and that AI, which is obviously the big buzz these days, can inadvertently drive polarization when being geared towards user satisfaction. So this particular study was interesting because it included both the probability, the cues, how we make our judgments on different things. But I think it also related a little bit more to persuasion than the previous application that I just shared, because if you can figure out these views of people and can map it, you can kind of use these terms and this information to kind of be more successful in your persuasive efforts and goals, which is what we see a lot of today online with the different algorithms and ads that we get on different networks. And the last application example that I kind of wanted to provide was in politics. In this case, I didn't pick a specific research article to zone in on. In full disclosure, I did have some access issues with a few different articles that were interesting to me in the political space and social judgment theory, but I did see lots of references to social judgment theory in politics. And in my opinion, I think social judgment theory and politics is a perfect marriage, because politics is all about persuasion, right? We know that it's used all the time to figure out, people want to know, why do we vote for different individuals over the other? Or why do we have certain positions on different issues? And I think this theory can help explain that. For example, if someone's anchor is that they're firmly in favor of the separation of church and state, it could help map why they are pro-choice, or why they feel that government shouldn't dictate whether or not two people should be allowed to marry. Another example is if someone's anchor is that the government should have limited involvement in the economy. It could explain why they would oppose higher taxes on the wealthy, or why they would be opposed to extensive social programs, because most likely it would conflict these core beliefs of the market should dictate these things and not the government in driving economic outcomes. So once again, social judgment theory, I think, is very useful when it comes to politics, and I think it could be in both forms, both the factors why we make decisions, which is more that origin of the theory, but also how it could definitely be used to make decisions. This happens all the time with Gallup polls. We see it in different political news discussions, is that people kind of try to take this information of why people think a different way and use it to meet their goals and ends. So kind of as I start to wrap up this presentation, I kind of wanted to look at things in summaries, and that social judgment theory can help us explain how people react to new ideas based on what they already believe. And it is especially important in persuasion, which is how it's being discussed in our readings this week, showing why some messages change our minds, while others cause people to dig in more to their anchors or to their beliefs. But social judgment theory also applies far beyond persuasion. It helps us understand decisions in healthcare, how opinions can spread online, and even why people take certain political stances. In short, it reminds us that people don't judge ideas in isolation, but they interpret them through the lens of their own existing beliefs. And before I sign off today, I wanted to give the class 2 different discussion prompts to consider. The first is to think about a time when you tried to persuade someone who was very strongly committed to their position. How did you frame your message? And do you think it landed in their latitude of acceptance or rejection? The other option is reflect on a belief or opinion you've held for a long time. How do you think your level of ego involvement within that belief has influenced how open or closed you've been to persuasive messages about it? So like I said, you can pick one of those 2 discussion prompts this week. And then here are all of my references that I used in putting this presentation together. And I can't wait to see everyone in the discussion forum later this week. Have a great day.